Good afternoon and most welcome to H 798. We are in the dungeon presently in our very lovely room number 9, which my dear colleague here persists in calling Versailles. There are actually some nice windows outside, and I think there are remnants from the original building, which actually was more or less a beauty, but that was in the past. Well, speaking about Versailles, Versailles has a lot of mirrors as well, as you might be aware of, and most of them are quite excellent. Usually gold frame, where some poor person in the 16th century or 17th century put thin layers of gold on top of the wooden frame. And framing things, that is another thing we also got from the mirror. I have been trying to curb my enthusiasm over the mirror. It's quite extraordinary, and I was supposed to discuss the whole thing yesterday with my friend, the professor in topology, but he was a bit too busy. I think that was good, but it is extraordinary. The mirroring thing is extraordinary. And I didn't mention that, but the book Kalle got for me, it's not half bad, as they say in London English. Not half bad means in Cockney rhyming slang, really good. So it's quite interesting. Thank you for that. It seems that my colleague needs to carry yet another book back home. Well, we see about that. Maybe we can leave it here for a while. Today I will continue and see about the consequences of this revolutionary insight about the mirror. And one thing that struck me, I will go into quite briefly in a moment, but let me once more repeat, because I think that's very important, the logocentric foundational structure: divide, prioritize, and marginalize. I think that's a rule of thumb that should be remembered. Use your fingers and use your thumb for divide. The thumb is usually the most important thing when you divide something. This is the one you press with. You press the knife, or you put the scissors together. That will help you to remember this. It's a movement, actually, and I think that's interesting, and I will get back to that later, but it is a movement. It's an action. It's not something you thought, it's something you do. And that is also important, because this thing does not easily lend itself to definition. Very hard to define. It becomes really elusive, and as Derrida wrote, he wrote his whole life sort of trying to chase this rabbit down the rabbit hole, because it cannot be defined. Otherwise, we would never have this need for deconstruction. And that is one of the interesting traits, but it could actually be perceived as an action. And it's very helpful that you actually do it. It's something you do when you divide. And division in itself is very helpful. We can divide a piece of paper and we get 2A5, divide it once more, and we get 4A6, divide it once more, and we get 8I7. And this changes the topology, because it's all down to topology. both according to quantum mechanics and Derrida, everything is taking place in space. And this idea of sort of not acknowledging that fact, that's the reason for the many paradoxes. And I think this mirror thing has helped to discover the original chasm. I call it the unknown chasm. But you will see later it's not a regular chasm. It has specific properties that are quite unusual, and it doesn't apply to anything in the world, which makes it yet quite elusive. And I'd say this is a preposterous thing to say, but I'm going to say this anyway. It's Friday afternoon and I'm allowed to say that. It's even a flag day today, so it's quite an important day here in Sweden. So I'm going to go for it and I'm going to say this solves the problem of dualism once and for all, finally. And I will also add a minor thing to that. It solves the problem of meaning/word. It's yet another very cumbersome problem. And I will start with a lesser one. I will look at the meaning/word. In all possible solutions for meaning and word, except Wittgenstein and in some reason Heidegger and Derrida, we usually see meaning word with a topology that is a line. It's a dividing line, it's a distance, and that distance is obvious. It's not the same thing, but they are connected. There is a connection. We usually call the connection some sort of unknown force. We had a suggestion the other day, it could be prana, it could also be ki. But there is a distance. How are they connected? And all solutions today usually go, well, they went until recently in the direction of only having the words, getting rid of meanings. Because for a very, very long time, we went into the opposite direction. We spoke only of meaning and we got rid of the words. And now it's a tendency to say that the words are the only important thing. And I think both solutions have some problems coming with them for obvious reasons, because none of them has been definitely accepted. And I think underneath the whole thing, it's down to earth. And this is one of those things that really bothers people who starts with, for instance, Jacques Derrida, and also was the case when it came to Barbara Tversky. I found some reviews of her book that also showed the same tendency. In Derrida, many people object to what is perceived to be a mixture between levels. He is very high up in the air, he is very abstract for a while, and then he goes down to the grit and start talking about the text and the space between the letters and everything, and start talking about the paper. It has two sides, the reverse, and well, I forgot the name of the first page. These things sound so weird, and I think it's that we cannot see any middle point between these, and that has to do with a mirror image, because with a mirror image there is no middle point. There are only two sides and they are distanced, but it's nothing in between. And oddly enough, the thing you start thinking about is the more natural, so to speak, the hologram. And how does the hologram work? It doesn't work like that. it's also sort of a reflection, but that reflection is gradual. It doesn't have a definite. When I look into the mirror, there is a in-between space that is quite definite. And it's the mirror that causes this effect. And I'm quite certain this specific effect was the idea in reality why dividing subject and object so sharp. Because this is not the usual thing to do in nature. There is not that sharpness. Actually, it's always gradual, without hardly any exception. The mirror can lend itself to this idea, but actually the mirror is also gradual, but it's very hard to see for normal perception. We think that the mirror image is just within the frame of the mirror, not outside it. That is actually wrong. But the normal perception is that everything is within the frame. It's sort of boxed in from both sides. It's boxed in this way, but it's also boxed in this direction. And you can feel that by prodding the mirror. That's often done for small children to show that the mirror image is not real. You prod the image and you show the little baby, it's completely flat. It's not real. This idea of flatness is scientifically wrong, but it doesn't matter. What I'm talking about now is the normal Western perception, and especially how the Greek perceived it. And in their perception, it's lent itself to an idea of a very, very sharp division between the things. And it could not be anything gradual going on. I've been thinking about these things before in different problems, especially when we pondered extra much 2 weeks one time Zenon's paradox somewhere in the 90s. And it never struck me that it could be the opposite. One of our solutions, of course, was mathematically solve the problem by introducing graduality into the problem. So we have a difference in the equations for the hare and the tortoise, and therefore the hare will catch the tortoise. This gradualization I thought could be the solution, but I'm beginning to realize that it's just the opposite. It started with a perception of a mirror image, and that was later transplanted to Zenon's paradox and one of 20 paradoxes we still have recorded from Greek civilization. They're all similar in different ways. We have the paradox with the pile and everything. The Greek don't seem to accept graduation. That seemed to be their problem. And I think it has to do with the mirror, because it's so sharp, it's so unnaturally sharp. And that's been used to start thinking of every measuring problem as being distinct and having no graduation. There is nothing in between two things. What does that come from? Who was the philosopher that already said that long before Socrates? It was actually Parmenides. That tendency was well established. Everything is distinct. It comes in portions. There is no gradual thing going on in between two objects. So they seem to have a problem with graduation. That I realized in the 90s, and so did the other people in my group. But now I think I found the reason for that. And it's actually started with a sort of rejection of all graduation. And it started because the Greek really thought the reality was that way. It's a mistake, but it was an honest mistake. And the mirror that has other important thing I mentioned before, creation of the mirroring subject, the reflective self we talked about before. But now I can see it actually enters into topology as well. It enters into mathematics. And the funny thing, in topology they are well aware that this distinct feature that they use is half illusory, but it's still usable. It's not part of reality. But the Greek thought it was the definite reality. That was in the bottom. And they never said it. They just assumed it. That's why I call it the unknown chasm. And the chasm isn't a chasm. There is no chasm to be stepped over. And one of the problems with meaning word is just we try to solve it one way or the other, when the actual solution is already out there, maybe very, very hard to understand. Of course, it is already in Wittgenstein's language games. Reasonably, exactly what he says word by word is that there is a graduation between something that is a word and that something is an object. It's no clear-cut difference. And that is a hard pill to swallow. But this makes it easier. See meaning and word as a graduation, where there is no actual just word and there is no actual meaning. It's always somewhere in between. And meaning and word work together at every instance. So we have a dual couple as we have in the text. So meaning is cooperating and we are putting the dividing line different at different moments. One of the ideas that started this in understanding for me was yesterday we talked about Japanese language, and they have these signs which they borrowed in from China. So they have a Chinese pronunciation, usually monosyllabic. It could be something like king or kin. And there is a Japanese reading that is usually polysyllabic, contains more than one syllable. And there is always a play between these different pronunciations. And the thing is, it's sometimes not clear if there is one meaning that's pertinent or the other one. They seem to be in the air both at the same time. Meaning doesn't seem to be decided always. And that is the important thing in communication, in doing things. Exactly the same thing as Wittgenstein says. Just because you don't have this definitiveness, you can do things in the world. Why is that? Because there is no clear-cut line between meaning and word. It's a graduation. And you can get in more precise and precise for every time you do it. But if you think there is a clear-cut division, which is something that only exists in Western culture, you are bound to make errors. And you cannot be flexible either with the word nor the meaning. And once we establish this here now, let's get over to the tougher nut to crack. Problem with dualism. And I think the problem with dualism is not that we should have a compromise in between the two, or as some people suggest. I checked on the internet, one of my favorite websites, which is actually called Non-dualism. It's a very good website, so I recommend it. Non-dualism. There are different articles there, and they are differently they have different approaches. Some are really stern and just writes very crude that let's get rid of dualism, let's not have it anymore. And obviously that's just way off the point. That's not in the right ballpark at all. And then we have these other people said we have to make it more soft or something like that. I think more in the terms that the problem is not that we have a division. The problem is we made a division not based on thinking. It just came by itself without thinking. And the mirror is such an obvious inspiration for this. It's a gestalt. And it's how the Greek perceive the mirror. Not the Indians, not the Africans, not the Aztec people. It's how the Greek perceive it. And they make something completely special. Their division cannot be recognized anywhere else. And it's been taken for complete granted ever since. And every time I meet up with some other language, some other people, I've been doing that myself, we naturally assume clear-cut division somewhere. And this I remember so much from Japanese. Even the Japanese got into that habit without really having it in their implicit body. But they showed it. You need to write a subject here. There's missing a subject. Always in a Japanese text there's missing a subject. If you're reading a book in Japanese book, there won't be subjects. So what we do when we translate, I have to translate for my second level, we need to put in subjects there, here and there. And sometimes you have this even more difficult. There's one word called omae, could mean me, could mean you. And the whole idea, it is actually meaning me or you. It's not true. It's somewhere in between. That's why the Japanese are using that specifically. Otherwise, they don't use any subject. There is a reason for using that word. And I realized somewhere this is absolutely wrong, and that hindered my understanding of Japanese. There must be a good reason for not using subjects. And they can do very well without subjects. There's no need for it in regular language. Actually, is incredibly much more effective. It makes for clarity in the language, a clarity we cannot achieve with our bindedness with the subject. And this is because also between subject and object there is a degree, and we need to at every moment tell whereabout that is. Where do we do the division? The first thing, the thumb thing, where do we cut? And we need to cut differently. Imagine you making a puzzle. I think that's a good analogy for the world, because a puzzle and a hologram are very similar. If you're going to make a hologram, whatever it's on the thinking side or if in the reality side, it doesn't matter. You need to cut differently. You need to decide what is the surrounding of this thermos and what is the thermos for some specific purpose. If you do it all the time without the purpose, you're going to end up in trouble. That doesn't make sense. It's clumsy, it's crude, and it makes for a difficult world. You need this flexibility. So the problem is not where you cut. The problem is these two things. When you start prioritizing and saying, they are very different. There is a prioritizing going on there already. The distancing is the possibility for prioritizing. And then you can always reverse the prioritizing. And Derrida writes that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what is put down and being marginalized or what's prioritized, because they are codependent. They are codependent, and it means that they actually have the same meaning and the same place. And that's an obvious problem in Western science to some degree, especially when it's made into the other subjects. You have this rotation all the time. We can see it in psychology, where they changed 5 times now. 5 times. Every time it's a complete reversal of what was going on before. And that reversal is, according to this, a surface thing. It doesn't change. The opposite is actually more or less the same as the thing that it's opposing. You can see it here. The important thing is where you cut, the actual movement, because there is an action here. And we'll be discussing the Hopi language, me and Kalle, back and forth. And this is a nice introduction to the Hopi language, because that is one of those languages that everything is an action, and you don't have these firm ideas. You don't have this stuckedness. And this stuckedness leads to a friction in thinking, because for some reason only Western culture has this division. And we think that we share the division in between languages. We do not. Shockingly enough, they can actually be quite different from person to person. The only thing that is similar between person to person and culture to culture in the Western cultures are that we don't move, we don't change. Me as a person, I don't change the dividing line. And that goes for stuckedness in thinking. And we mentioned some of those stuckedness before. Kalle is very interested in the monosemic. I am very interested in this idea in linguistics, where they try to find the original meaning or the original word. Both those things goes well. And they are still to this day, 2022, very pertinent research areas. But as you see, the problem starts here. So those ways can never be resolved, because we are using an idea that there is only one tool, and that the tool is not flexible. This perceived division in Western culture is completely arbitrary. It just happened. It cannot be explained. It doesn't have a reason for why it started, and that is a problem that makes it impossible to attack. Nobody said let it be there. It just started anyway. And the other part of the problem is, just because you make something arbitrarily, that's a really big piece of know-knowing there. You don't know why. And you are going to carry that know-knowing with you your whole life. It's a little bit like you were born with shields on the side, and you never realized you can look wider. And you make an ontology from this, which we did. Our whole ontic development is based on this. And we open that, we can make a proper thing, we can make an ontology, we can understand being, as Heidegger said. So this is a completely hazardous distinction. It's unknown and unspoken, and it cannot be defined, and therefore it cannot be attacked either. You can't attack a mistake. It's very hard, because there's no one behind it defending it. It just happened. And it's on top of that completely idiosyncratic to the Western culture. And maybe down at the bottom, it cannot even be understood by any other culture. You have to have it in your body, and it's a specific life world. And this reminds me a little about Wittgenstein. He said, if a lion would be able to speak, we would not understand what it said, because we don't share life world. Their life world is completely different from our life world. And there is, of course, as Wittgenstein understood, there is no permanent, fixed difference. And he said himself that when he realized, he also relaxed in his bodily system. Because to have this dividing line, it's a tension somewhere. It cannot exist without attention. You need to do something that makes you not aware of this world and of your body, of your bodily incarnation. So there is a tension going hand in hand with that. So we are keeping that tension, and I'm not going to speculate here. I'm just going to give a little pista, as they say in Spanish, a little hint. That could be one of the reasons why we have this body problem as we have in the West. But enough about that. I think that's quite enough. I'm going to curb my enthusiasm for this incredibly interesting development. And I wish you a really pleasant good afternoon and say thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you.